right. Just a little bit of a plug. I have known Tyler for probably about 20 years. And I don't know if he'll have the time next Sunday to go over his story about how they ended up in Czech Republic. But I can guarantee you he and his wife's faithfulness to what God has called them to. It's a pretty amazing and circuitous route. And they had a couple opportunities where I think all of us would be in agreement that, like, you have every reason to bow out of what God has called you to. And yet they've been faithful. And so he's been a real faithful brother throughout the years. And he's very genuine. He's very real as well. So I'd encourage you to make the time of being able to be here on Sunday afternoon. And he's going to teach for us. And then he's going to have the Q&A time, as Alan had mentioned. All right. Well, open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. Anybody here ever been sold a lemon? No? I don't know. Rob thinks I got sold a lemon a while back. But, whether it was a used car or, maybe it was an employer that made a promise of a promotion and then kind of reneged on that. They rescinded it. Maybe your parents or a coach or someone made you a promise and you waited and you waited and you waited, and then the last moment they said, oh, sorry, it's not going to happen. Whether it's happened to you or not, you could probably imagine how you would feel. And how you would feel towards that person that seemingly went back on their promise. That seemingly was doing something completely contradictory to what they had just repeatedly told you was going to come to pass. I want you to keep that in mind today as we are looking at Genesis chapter 22. Because by all intents and purposes, we have something that seems similar to that situation in this account. In verse 1 of chapter 22, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I tell thee of." We're going to see in chapter 22 that God seems to go back on a promise that he had made Abraham. Or at least Abraham cannot, what he's telling Abraham to do here in chapter 22 does not jive. It does not match up with the promises that God had made to him years and years and years ago. Promises that he had repeated over and over and over. And we're going to see how does Abraham handle this situation when what God has called him to do and the circumstances in front of him seem to conflict with his understanding of a good and a faithful God. And hopefully it'll be an encouragement to us, because there are probably situations in your life right now, or have been in the past or in the future, that from your perspective, it's very difficult for you to relate that circumstance to a God who is good and faithful. And yet, I think we see in the life of Abraham, we see some principles there that ought to be true in our own lives as well. But he says here in verse 1, he says, "And it came to pass after these things." In Genesis chapter 21, we see the birth of Isaac. The birth of this son that the long anticipated, right? The long awaited son of promise. It finally comes to fruition after about a 25-year wait. We see the birth of Isaac in chapter 22. He says, after these things, after all these things had come to pass, this is when God calls on Abraham now to offer this son. Just a little bit of context. We're not going to be able to be definitive about this, but Abraham's age in Genesis chapter 22 is about 105, 115 years old. This would put Isaac in the 5-year-old to 15-year-old range. Broad range, developmentally, but he's a young boy. But really, we have to go back to the beginning of the biblical account with Abram. And we actually see that in Genesis chapter 12. So let's go ahead and turn there. Genesis chapter 12. Abram is the young age of 75. He's just wet behind his ears. And we see him living in the land of Ur the Chaldees. In verse 1 it says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran." So we see this actually when we look at some other passages that help us understand what's going on here. This Genesis chapter 12 doesn't give us the full account, but he was in the land of Ur, and then he moves, and he does a partial move here at this point. He moves to the city of Haran. Actually, his father goes with him at this time, and it isn't for a number of years, it isn't until his father passes away that he moves out into the land that we know today, we would reference as the Promised Land. Abram at this time was childless. And we also know from Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, that Abram was an idolater. He had no track record, he had no history of worshiping the Lord God of the universe, the author of creation, as we sang. He was an idolater, just like the rest of those in Ur the Chaldees, worshiping the false gods of that particular land. And yet God graciously chose Abram, not because of anything that he had done, but simply because of God's choosing and his choice. But then we go to Genesis chapter 13, after he makes this initial promise to him. And look what he says here. He said, before we go there, verse 2, he says, "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee." It's very difficult to make a nation out of an individual unless they have some descendants. And at this point, he and his wife Sarah, who's about 10 years younger than he, are childless. Now we move to chapter 13, in verses 14 through 18. Chapter 13, verse 14. It says, "And the Lord said unto Abram, and after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered." Once again, we have this promise being reconfirmed to Abram. At this point, he is... we're not sure exactly how old he is, somewhere between 75 and 85 years old. But Lot separates from him. Lot is kind of looking at these lush pastures for his flocks, and he heads out, and God comes to Abram maybe in a moment of discouragement, and he kind of encourages him with this promise. And he says that your seed will be as the dust of the earth. You think we go out to Pensacola Beach and you get one of those, little buckets, steal it from your kid and you scoop up one of those big yellow beach buckets, right? And you try to imagine pouring that out and counting every single grain of sand. Just in that one bucket. Probably thousands and thousands. And he's saying that your seed will number as the dust of the earth. He's telling him that your nation will be a great number of people. Once again, Abram's got to be scratching his head. God, getting a little older here. How's this all going to work out? But God reconfirms that promise. Then, Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. God comes to him again. Abram, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. What I promised you before you move down to the land, you're going to have a great nation. You're going to have descendants. It's going to be your seed. And so he says in verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. This was on the heels of Abram's victory when Lot was captured in this war between the kings. Lot mounts up with his men, and they go fight off these other kings, and he trees Lot and the folks that were captured with him. In verse 2 it says, And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. So Abram's getting really practical with God. You're making these promises to me, God, but I'm still not seeing any kids. I've got this steward. I've got this guy in the house who runs things. He makes sure we don't run out of toilet paper, and we got enough Fruit Loops in the pantry. And is this the guy? At that time in the ancient Near East, that would have been customary. If someone didn't have a son, that they would pass their inheritance down to the steward of their home. But God says, no, that's not what I'm promising you. Verse 4, he says, Behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. No, it's your biological, your child that's going to come from you and Sarah. That is the individual that will be the beginning of this nation that I promised you. Then he says in verse 5, And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. Once again, he doesn't use the illustration of the dust of the earth, but he does use the stars in the sky. My mom just told me she went up to the Little League World Series just last weekend to see the championship. And there's actually a park not too far from Williamsport. And it's one of the 10 best places in the country to see, I forget what they call it, but the night sky, but basically a dark viewing of it without any outside light or anything like that. And you imagine what it would look like, in the ancient Near East, and just being able to gaze on star after star after star after star. And he says, that is how many descendants that you will have. And we have here in verse 6, and he says, And he believed in the Lord, and he, being God, counted it to him for righteousness. It was at that moment when Abraham became a believer. It was that moment when he was saved. When we see this terminology that the author of Genesis uses here, it's the same terminology that we would understand in Romans, where we are counted or reckoned to be righteous by God. Didn't mean that Abraham was a righteous man, but God gave him credit for righteousness. Just like you and I, if we put our faith in Jesus Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection, God credits us for that kind of righteousness. So at this time, we're looking at Abram as being about 85 years old. Well, let's go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 16 now. Abram is about 86 years old at this point. So this is about a couple of years maybe after he believed this promise, and he is accounted as righteousness. Verse 1, it says, Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abraham, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Hey, there's impatience here. I gotta be honest, this sounds really weird to me. This is a different culture, different period of time, but Abram said, okay, Sarah, we'll do it your way. And we see a flicker of doubt, a flicker of impatience, a flicker of unbelief in both Abram and Sarah. And yet this physical union between Abram and Hagar bears a son, Ishmael. But this isn't the one. This isn't what God had promised Abram. And we're going to see that in Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17, verse 15. bear with me here. I know we're going over these, but I really want us to understand just how many times God was reiterating to Abraham, this is what I'm going to do. This is a promise. This is a promise. And so in Genesis 17, verse 15, it says, And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarah thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? My Grandma Roddy, she's still kicking it, man. I think she's 95 years old. Her mind is sharp as a tack. She still reads voraciously. She does crossword puzzles and all that kind of stuff. But I just could not conceive of her having a child at this age. And that's essentially what Abraham's saying to myself. This is absolutely insane. Right? I am 100 years old. My wife is younger than me, but she is 90. How is this going to happen? And verse 18, it says, And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed. And thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. Abraham so often was just trying to think of how, like from a human perspective, right? All right, well, it must be Eliezer. No, it's not Eliezer. Well, it must be Ishmael. And God's like, no. It's going to be a son through a union between you and Sarah. Inconceivable by medical practices and what we know. This is going to be a miraculous birth that he says. Then we see here in Genesis chapter 21, we see the birth. We see the fulfillment of this long-awaited, long-anticipated promise. A promise that he held out for 25 years. How old were you when you first started thinking about getting your driver's license? 12? I mean, Art, you were probably 3 years old and you were like, I can't wait to drive, right? But some of us, maybe 12, 13, where you're like, oh yeah, that would be pretty cool, right? And then you start getting older and you start seeing the juniors and seniors in high school and they're driving. You're like, man, I can't wait to get my freedom. I want to drive a car. And, it starts building in this crescendo. But can you imagine waiting 25 years? And each year, each tick of the clock, it seems in your mind less and less likely that this could possibly become true. And yet now it finally comes through at the age of 100. We see God fulfilling this promise. Kind of in our mind, we're thinking Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, they put Isaac in the car seat and pop him on the back of the camel and they ride off into the sunset, right? Here's the promise. It's been waited for 25 years and now boom. But we don't have that. We actually have chapter 22. Something that is going to come into a great deal of conflict with this promise. This promise that Isaac would be the beginning of a nation. When God says here in verse 2, he says, Take now thy son, thine only son. From God's perspective, God was dealing with Isaac and not Ishmael. And then he says this, the son whom thou lovest. Couldn't you imagine the fondness that Abraham and Sarah would have for Isaac as being this supernatural baby? Right? The fulfillment of a promise that God made with them. And so we see this tenderness, we see this love, we see this closeness that the father has towards his son. And you just think about every time he saw Isaac, right? Mom's feeding him the mashed up Gerber peas, and he's running around playing with his toys, or he's chasing the sheep and the flocks. But every time he saw his son Isaac, it was a constant reminder of God's goodness, his power, and his faithfulness. Just this constant reminder to him that this is an act of God. And so what we're going to see here in this test that we see in verse 1, he says that God did tempt or test Abraham. This test involves not just an act of simple obedience, but wrestling with the conflict of how God's command was seemingly contradictory to his previous promise. How could God demand me to do this act of cruelty to the son that I love when he has been so good and so faithful to me for the last 25, 30 years? How does this jive? This doesn't even seem like the same God. God, you told me that this son would be the beginning of a nation, and now you want me to offer him as a burnt sacrifice? There had to be, in his mind, just wrestling with this idea. So we see this idea of testing in verse 1. This God tempting him. This word testing or tempting, it comes from the Hebrew word nasah. It simply means to put to the test, to determine the quality of something. It's the idea of what will occur at the Bema seat when the church will stand before Christ after the rapture, and Jesus will determine the quality of our works since we've been saved. And there will be some works, right, that don't pass the test. Works that we have done in our own self-interest, in our own worked up our own self-effort. We've done it from maybe selfish motivations, and those are the wood, hay, and stubble. But the things that we've done and we've relied upon God's strength. God, I can't do this, but I'm going to trust you that you're going to make this possible. God, I want to please you. God, this is hard. This I don't want to do this, but I know you want me to do it, so I'm going to take this step. Those are the things that he's going to discern as have the quality of eternal quality. And so this idea of testing here, he's putting Abraham to the test. He's testing the quality, and it's going to be testing the quality of Abraham's faith. We see the same Hebrew word being used often of Israel in the wilderness. Right? So God delivers them out of Egypt, delivers them from Pharaoh's bondage, and they get out there and they cross the Red Sea, and there's one logistic issue after another. They get to the first place, and there's bitter water. What are we going to drink? We're in the desert, right? There's no Cumberland Farms. There's no Tom Thumb. We can't get a 79-cent, 44-ounce soda around the corner here. What are we going to do? And so God was allowing that as a period of testing. Are they going to trust me? Are they going to trust that I am going to fulfill to them the promise that I made to them? We see it with the promise of manna, right? They were complaining about the lack of food. They were complaining about their hunger. Once again, the nation of Israel did not demonstrate faith in God, and yet God provides them manna. And we see this idea of testing once again. God wants to see the quality of their faith. Will they trust that whether they can see it or not, whether it looks like a logistical problem, are they going to rest and trust in God's promise to care for them and take them into the promised land? Various times they needed water. Once again, this word is used over and over. And then at Mount Sinai, it is used again and again. Constantly, during their journeys in the wilderness, God was testing the nation of Israel, testing the quality of their faith. What would these circumstances reveal about their faith in Jehovah? Was it a genuine faith? Would that faith falter? Would they go back to Egypt? Right? And so now we see here in verse 3, and we read this, and it says, "And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him." Whatever internal conflict would have been going on in Abraham's heart and mind, it is definitely not obvious in this text. He wasn't hitting the snooze button, right? Hoping that maybe God would change his mind. Well, maybe if I hit the snooze button 20 times, God will wake up and he'll be like, "Oh, I'm just kidding, Abraham." Or no. What does it say? He rose up early in the morning. And then you start seeing him making preparations for the journey. He saddles up the donkey. He gets the wood that's necessary. He recruits 2 of his young men, servants, to go with them. He gets Isaac up, right? He makes the necessary steps. Sometimes if you've been out working, right? You're out in the heat and you've had a job, and sometimes you simply have to will yourself to take that next step forward. Right? Just one more step. One more step. If you've ever run a long distance race, same idea. You know, they talk about in a marathon, hitting the wall at mile 20. And your body starts shutting down, your brain starts shutting down. You're like, I'm questioning my life's choices at this point. But in order to finish, you just basically have to tell yourself, one step forward, one more step, one more step. And here we see Abraham doing that, just taking the next step in this process. He's methodically taking care of these provisions. In verse 4, he says, Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. It's a 3-day journey on the back of a donkey. You imagine there are probably quite a few opportunities to pull a U-turn, right? It's a big wide space. You ever seen pictures of the wilderness out there in Israel? And there's plenty of opportunities to turn that donkey around. Like, this is crazy. I'm not doing this. And yet he continued on going in that direction. We don't see him dawdling or he is moving in that direction. And then verse 5. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. He makes this interesting statement, doesn't he? For someone who has just been told by God to offer his son as a burnt sacrifice, look what he says to his servants. My son and I are going up, and we're going to worship God, but then we'll be back. There is something that is going on in Abraham where in his mind, he is reconciling the fact that what God had just commanded him to do, even though it seems completely contradictory to the promise that he had made to him about Isaac, that God is going to provide something. I've got to obey God, but God's going to do something here. And he's believing that his son was going to return with him. Verse 6, it says, And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Dads, can you imagine your kid asking you this question, knowing what God had just called you to do? The gut punch, right? Your kid's like, Hey, Dad, thanks for bringing me to the sacrifice thing, but where's the lamb? And yet, how does Abraham respond? My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Abraham is expressing faith in God's provision, although it was obvious to Isaac that there was no provision. Isaac's looking around. I don't see a lamb. I don't see a sacrifice. It's obvious to his son, right? He's looking from human eyes, but Abraham is looking with eyes of faith. This can't be, he's saying that this can't be the end of Isaac. So what is he holding on to in this moment of darkness, in this moment of seeming conflict, the circumstances of the situation? He's holding on to who he knows God is and who he has revealed himself to be for the last 25, 30, 35 years. Verse 29, and they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Once again, Abraham is going through this entire process. He's doing exactly what God had told him to do. There's no relief in sight yet. God hasn't shouted from heaven, stop, right? But he's putting one foot in front of another. And he's obeying God. And then it says in verse 10, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He even got to the point where he lifts the knife and he's ready to plunge it into the son of promise. Now, we get some insight in the New Testament of what actually was going through Abraham's mind at this point. So let's go and turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 17 and 19. Hebrews 11, verse 17 and 19. In this chapter known as the Hall of Faith, the author of Hebrews writes this. He says, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, when he was tested by God, when God put him in a situation where God was going to test the quality of his faith, he offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. So the author of Hebrews is bringing out that seeming conflict between what God had promised and what he commanded Abraham to do by sacrificing his son. And in verse 19, we read this, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. What he's saying here is that in Abraham's mind, he had killed Isaac. He had gone through that process. He had made the determination in his mind to slay his son. But he said, I'm going to trust God that he's still going to fulfill this promise, even if it means that Isaac is going to be resurrected from the dead. But in his mind, he had already plunged the knife into his son, is essentially what that verse is saying. He had done the deed already. He had not committed the act. So now when we go back to Genesis chapter 22, we see God stopping the situation. But before we look at God stopping the situation, we got to ask ourselves, how did Abraham reconcile this seeming cruelty with the goodness and faithfulness of God he had come to know? And over again in chapter 22, we see him thinking positive thoughts about God. He tells his son that God will provide a lamb. He believed in Hebrews that God would raise him from the dead. He told the servants, my son and I will return. The way Abraham reconciled these things was by believing by faith in who he knew God was, even at probably the darkest moment of his life. He continued to believe that God is good and faithful. So my question is, why? Why would God put the individual known as the friend of God through this kind of ordeal? Let me ask you this. If you put your friends through an ordeal similar to this, they probably would, unfriend you on Facebook, right? They probably block your calls, probably never want to have anything to do with you ever again. And yet God allows his friend to go through this. Well, look what we see here in chapter 22, verse 12. And he said, lay not thy hand upon the lad. Verse 11. Angel of the Lord called out called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. It is at that moment that God does make provision for a sacrifice. But Abraham passed the test. Abraham demonstrated the quality of his faith in God. That he had come to the point in his life after many, many, many years that he was willing to hold on to the truth of God's goodness and his faithfulness, even when life seemed to contradict that. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, we see God makes a statement to the nation of Israel about why he was allowing them to be tested as well. In Deuteronomy 8:1, he says, All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, right, to test thee, the quality of your faith, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. God allowed this to go on in Abraham's life so that there would be a demonstration what was going on in the inside. We can go through the motions of our relationship with the Lord, right? We can show up here on a regular basis, but we can do that from the wrong motivations, right? We can put on the clothing, we can do the part. And yet, many times that's absent from genuine faith in God and his promises. But it's these ordeals. It's these circumstances. It's these seeming contradictions that God allows in our lives that are the things that are the truest test on the quality of our faith, whether we really believe that God is who he says he is. But not only does it reveal something about our heart, but it reveals something even more specific. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 13. Deuteronomy 13, and we'll look at verses 1 through 3. Within the law, he told the nation of Israel not to follow false prophets. And he says, If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass, whereof he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proveth you, he tests you, to know whether ye love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. There are circumstances that God allows in our lives to determine not just the quality of our faith, but whether we actually love God. This was not mindless, robotic obedience on the part of Abraham. Unfeeling, unemotional. Right? This situation must have grieved him seriously. And yet, while it was grieving him seriously, he was still holding on what he knew to be true about God. Even to the point that just like God had done a supernatural work so that Isaac could actually be born, he was convinced that God could do the same thing to bring him back from life. So I guess my question to myself, to you, is there any circumstance in your life? Is there any scripture that you are struggling with right now that seems to contradict God's goodness and his faithfulness to you? Maybe we've even questioned God's goodness and his faithfulness as a result of something that's happened in our lives. I think we see in the life of Abraham here in chapter 22, one of the big keys is that he refused to give in to those circumstances. He refused to look at this situation, even what God had commanded him to do, as being a sign that God wasn't good. And when he told his servants that we'll be back, when he told his son that God's going to provide someone, when we see the author of Hebrews giving us that insight that he was convinced that God was going to fulfill his promise, even if it had something supernatural like resurrection from the dead for Isaac have to happen. But he was convinced that God was going to be true to his word. And so my encouragement to you and I, in those moments of darkness, in those moments when life doesn't seem to match up with what God has allowed in your life, doesn't seem to match up with a God who is love, a God who is faithful, and a God who is powerful. Keep holding on to what we know about him. Keep holding on and trusting him. And there is something sweet about passing that test. And it will draw us closer to him than we've ever been. So if you're doubting, if you're struggling, if you're hurting,